I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today for a lunchtime talk. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we meet on, in this case virtually, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. This talk, we're very excited to be co-presenting between the Department of Chinese Studies and the China Studies Center. So special thanks to Ping from the China Studies Center for the technical support today. And the third co-organizer is the Australian Society for Asian Humanities, and Minerva will introduce the speaker on their behalf.
Okay, great. Thank you, Josh. So I'm Minerva Inwald. I'm a research affiliate and sessional lecturer in the Department of History at the University of Sydney. I'm also the seminars officer for the Australian Society for Asian Humanities, formerly OSA. And I'm very excited that we can work with the Department of Chinese Studies and the China Studies Center today to bring you a really interesting and exciting speaker, Gina Ann Tam. So Gina is an assistant professor of Chinese history at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. She received her PhD from Stanford University in 2016, and her teaching and research focuses on the construction of collective identity, national belonging, ethnicity, and race in modern China. In addition to her book, Dialect and Nationalism in China, she has also published peer-reviewed work in 20th century China, and has written about the relevance of her work to current events in foreign affairs, the nation, and dissent. And her new project, which sounds very interesting to me, will be a global history of Chinese restaurateurs and the making of Pan-Asian cuisine in the 20th century. So I'm going to hand over to Gina now, who will talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time afterwards for questions. So thank you, Gina.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much to the China Studies Center, to the Chinese Department, and to the Australian Society for Asian Humanities. And Josh and Minerva and Ping, thank you so much for having me and for putting this all together. I'm so excited to see so many people here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully this will work. I hope that we can see that. The hosts all, Minerva and Josh disappeared and Ping disappeared, but I hope that everyone can see that. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and start then. So I wanna start my talk here with a really simple question, okay? What is the Chinese language? If I were to ask average people, probably in Australia, certainly in Texas, and in China or outside of it, then their answer would probably be what we in English call Mandarin. Mandarin is the language that's taught in schools throughout the People's Republic of China and Taiwan. It's what you would hear in shopping malls, on TV, from political leaders. It's also the language that if we went to the UN or the WHO would probably be the language that would represent China. And it is the language that almost entirely, with some exceptions, but few exceptions, comprises Chinese language education around the world. Right. Last I checked on your website, I believe that generally speaking, your Chinese studies major and Chinese language classes are taught in Mandarin. That is certainly true of my university in Texas. We have a Chinese major there, and if you majored in Chinese at Trinity University, you would be taking Mandarin classes. Yet Mandarin is by no means the only language that could be called Chinese. We'll leave aside the Chinese script for now. We could talk about that more in Q&A if you'd like, but for now we'll leave it aside, right? But Chinese also refers to a large number of oral languages that are mutually unintelligible with Mandarin. It can refer to ancient or archaic Chinese, the terms we use to talk about recreations of languages likely spoken hundreds or even thousands of years ago in the place that we today call China. It can also refer to an enormous number of local languages spoken across the Chinese-speaking world, or the Sinophone world is another term you'll hear. This can include really well-known ones like Cantonese or Fujianese. Cantonese is pretty widely spoken in Australia and has tens of millions of speakers, but it can also refer to dozens, if not hundreds of others. And lest we think this map here, which is nicely color-coded, represents the entirety of Chinese linguistic diversity, within each of these regions, right, there are more mutually unintelligible languages spoken within them. Now, the PRC, or the People's Republic of China, the PRC's government, officially recognizes these languages, from the widely spoken ones to the smaller, even like variants that have some differences but are mutually intelligible, as Fangyan. Right? That's the term that we use. And this term in English, we would almost always translate it as dialect. After sort of much consternation on my part, that is indeed the translation that I use on the cover of my own book, right? But such a translation is really inherently problematic. When we think about dialects, we often think of them being subordinate. Calling something a dialect only makes sense if it is a dialect of something, right? Moreover, linguists will stress that dialects, generally speaking, are mutually intelligible with the language they are a dialect of and of one another. The problem here is that such criteria don't apply to all or even most Chinese Fangyan. Cantonese is not mutually intelligible with Shanghainese, Qingdaoese is not mutually intelligible with Hakka, and Cantonese, Shanghainese, and Hakka are not mutually intelligible with Mandarin. Qingdaoese arguably is, right? And though the Chinese government calls Mandarin a language, a title not afforded to other Fangyan, Fangyan are certainly not derived from Mandarin. But despite the fact that this translation is deeply misleading at best, discourse from the PRC government and in popular forums not only insists that Fangyan ought to be translated as the English word dialect, it also presumes that Fangyan should be treated as though they have all of the same connotations as dialect. Educational materials educational materials and popular media will call Fangyan variants or branches of the Chinese language. And high-profile government figures are often found directly refuting the suggestions that Fangyan could be considered independent languages. But there was a very famous sort of situation in 2016 where a consultant from the PRC to Hong Kong's education system claimed that Cantonese was not a mother tongue, but rather just a variant. His argument was that languages belong to ethnicities, and Cantonese speakers were Han Chinese, and therefore they weren't their own ethnicity, and therefore they couldn't have their own language, and because the only representative language of Chinese people was Mandarin. Right? This elicited quite the backlash in Hong Kong. So this is how Fangyan are treated, right? Mandarin, on the other hand, is officially called the common language of the Han people and the Chinese nation. Rhetoric will say that it is the only thing that allows society to be preserved, develop, and progress. Here's a picture from a Shanghai elementary school. The child is holding a sign that says "Promulgate Mandarin and together build the China dream." And it's not just the PRC government that repeats this rhetoric. Governments abroad, such as the government of Singapore, have insisted that the only real Chinese is Mandarin. And outside of state rhetoric, we see this in other powerful institutions. Recently, there's been a sort of big debate and protest at Stanford University, my alma mater, because they have been sort of trying to cut their Cantonese language programs, and they've changed the language classes that they teach. Used to be called Modern Mandarin, now it's called Modern Standard Chinese. Okay, so if dialect is a pretty egregiously misleading translation of Fangyan, why is there this widespread insistence, both within the PRC and outside of it, that Chinese Fangyan ought to be translated as dialects, and more importantly, that they should be treated as subsidiary, less important, or even conflatable with Mandarin? This is something that happened, you'll hear this happen when sort of Fangyan programs get cut. It's like, well, we already have Mandarin, we don't need these other Chinese languages, right? Okay, so the purpose of this talk is to explore how this happened, why this happened, and more importantly, why it matters at all. More specifically, this talk will show how the presumption that non-Mandarin Chinese languages are nothing more than dialects, a presumption that very much affects the relationship between language and identity today, resulted from battles over competing understandings of the Chinese nation that began in the early 20th century and were solidified in the early years of the PRC. First, I want to talk a little bit at the beginning about the construction of the Chinese national language in the early 20th century, focusing on how battles over what should constitute that language solidified a shift in how Fangyan were imagined, a shift from thinking of them as local languages that were not subordinate to dialects that were imagined as subsidiary to the national standard. I will then move into the early PRC, focusing on how this hierarchical framework for understanding language and Fangyan were influenced by Marxist theory, and then embedded in the state and societal structures of the People's Republic. I'll then end by talking a little bit about the state of linguistic hierarchies today. Let's start by talking about the origin of the national language. Today, what we in English call Mandarin in the PRC is called Putonghua, or the common speech, and it is defined as Beijing's pronunciation as standard pronunciation, Northern Fangyan as based Fangyan, and modern standard vernacular literature as the basis for vocabulary and grammar. Now, as far as how it became this way, when I first began writing this book and talking to people, in particular in the South where I did my archival research, people really like to tell me about how this happened. I think for those researchers out there, you'll find that when you start talking to people about your research topic, there are some things that people really like to tell you about your research, and this was one of them for me. The story that I got told over and over again went something like this. There was a conference to choose the national language. People voted, and then Beijing won the battle to be the national language. Where in Guangzhou, which is where I did a lot of my archival work, people love to, in particular, lament that their mother tongue lost the status of national language by only a handful of votes. So I get a lot of Cantonese lost by 3 votes, like a lot of those kinds of, like that story I got told a lot. So like most good, commonly retold historical narratives, there's a mix of truth and strategic myth-making. As we just noted here, right? Or as in this slide, right? Beijing's language would be chosen to serve as the basis of the national language. And there was indeed a conference, there were lots of them, to sort of determine what standard Chinese would look like. And in one of them, there was something arguably kind of like a vote, but it wasn't people voting for their own Fangyan, but we'll get to that, okay. To me, this retelling, however, really misses a lot of stuff in really important ways. One of the things it misses is that what we call Putonghua today was not China's first national language. And in fact, it wasn't called Putonghua until the 1950s. Before that, it was called Guoyu. But a national language based on the language of Beijing was not China's first national language. So I think that's one of the first sort of things that's important to understand. But maybe what I find most misleading about this particular story is the presumption that this was a contentious process because everyone was just clamoring for their own Fangyan to be the national language. That everyone was like, I vote for Beijing, I vote for Guangzhou, or something like that. And that the operative question when choosing a national, or when creating a national language, was always, which Fangyan do we choose? But if we look at how the debates unfolded, and in particular how China's first national language was founded, we find that this was by no means the key question being asked. We find that the operative question for language reformers was much less, which Fangyan do we choose to be the standard? And much more, what does it actually mean for a language to represent a nation? Let's take a look at this infamous conference as an example to highlight this. It happened in 1913, 2 years after the Republic of China had replaced a 300-year-old dynasty and a millennia-old imperial system. As nation and state builders struggled to take a Chinese nation from dream to reality, they hotly debated what it was that actually made a nation powerful. On the topic of language, there was one particular narrative that really rang true. The absence of a unified national language signaled the nation's vulnerability and collapse. The brand new Republic's Ministry of Education took this criticism really seriously. And in February of 1913, they called on several dozen delegates, 70-ish, 72-ish. They called on 80, but only about 70, some of them showed up, to participate in a conference that would determine the standard pronunciation of the Chinese national language. They were given a standard list of characters taken from Kangxi's dictionary, and advocated for what they thought the pronunciation of each character should be. Now, we might think that each person may have filled it out based upon how they themselves pronounce characters. So like if I'm from Guangzhou, I'm gonna fill it out the way that I pronounce characters in Guangzhou. But actually that's not what the majority of them did, and that's not how the conference concluded. Rather, the language that they initially came up with was something that they believed represented an amalgamation of the key characteristics of a bunch of different Fangyan. And was about 80 to 90% similar to the phonology of Beijing, but the remaining 10 to 20% of its phonology comprised of characteristics taken from other Fangyan. The big sticking point in particular was that a lot of Southern Fangyan make distinctions between characters that hold like a stop ending, right? Like a K at the end or a T at the end, which Northern Fangyan and Beijing Fangyan in particular does not, right? So that they included this, they stuck that in there, right? Now, why did they do this, right? Why did they make this kind of like Frankensteinian Chinese language, right? The key reason is that for many of the first constructors of the Chinese national language, they believed that no one particular Fangyan had the ability to represent the nation in its entirety. Now, there were some who did. Right? There were some who looked at France and looked at Japan, who were going through their own kind of national language programs at the time, Japan in particular. And those two countries took the language of the seat of government as their standard, and some of these reformers at this conference thought that they should do the same, right? But that proposal to take the seat of government was met with pretty fierce opposition. The opposition argued that Beijing was the capital of the fallen Qing dynasty, a dynasty run by non-Han Chinese people, right? And that Beijing was in a region that for large swaths of Chinese history had been ruled by non-Han Chinese ethnic groups, right? And because of this reason, they believed that Beijing was too foreign. There was a lot of talk of like Han ethnic purity in these discussions, and that therefore Beijing couldn't be an acceptable representative of China. Instead, they argued that any language that represented the Chinese nation should not be simply chosen from existing Fangyan, but constructed as an ideal. And in particular, their ideal was that it represented the unity of Han Chinese people and the language that they spoke at the dawn of Chinese civilization thousands of years ago. Right? In other words, in creating this national language, the majority of conference goers believed that a language that at once represented the nation's present while also embodying its shared ethnic past had to be an amalgam that they themselves, I guess you could say, recreated, right? Now, in this vision, Fangyan are not subsidiaries, they're not branches, right? They're within them are held pieces of a puzzle that taken together gives us the full picture of what the Chinese nation was. So in 1913, we have our first Chinese national language. It's a new invention for a new nation. After a few years of, however, this 1913 national language pleased very few people. Those who had been tasked with the practical work of promulgating it quickly saw its shortcomings because very few people, if anybody, actually spoke this language. It got mocked a lot as some sort of unnatural amalgam. And even those who initially were on board, like, yeah, we can do this, it's so creative and bold, they began to slowly doubt the practicality of it. Let's take, for instance, this man, Julian Ren, Julian Ren, the father of Chinese linguistics. Zhao was a graduate of Cornell and Harvard, and he was so committed to this idea of a new perfect Chinese national language that he made a recording of it in 1921. But by 1924, so like 3 years later, he was very quietly telling his friends and family in letters that he kind of believed that this was going to fail. Oops, sorry, too far. That he believed that this was going to fail. Right? He wrote in like a green letter that he's like, it's going to be based on the language of Beijing. I'm just not ready to admit it yet. So he wrote that in 1924. Then in 1925, he joined a bunch of other reformers to formally propose to the government and the Ministry of Education that Beijing's language should just be the national standard. Later in life, he showed a lot of, to me, what I read as mixed feelings about this. Like in some ways, he was a little defensive. He's like, well, you know, like Chinese people throughout history have learned new languages. This is nothing new for them. But he also kind of admitted that it was going to be impossible to promulgate. Probably the most famous line that he said about this was, he said, for 13 years, I was the sole speaker of this idiolect, meant to be the national language of 400, 500, or 600 million speakers. Okay, so in 1925, the language of Beijing was made the national language. It was done, it took me a really long time to sort of like dig this up, so it was done with very little fanfare. And this dream of a hybrid national language faded away. But calling the language of Beijing China's national language, when linguistically it's just another Fangyan, didn't immediately make it a language in the eyes of the public. Similarly, calling Fangyan non-national languages didn't immediately make them variants or subsidiaries. In order to make the hierarchy between language and Fangyan make sense, state actors and their collaborators had to convince the general public that their new national language could represent the whole nation. Inversely, connotations inherent in the word dialect, its presumption of hierarchy and dependence, had to become, right, like that had to be created as something that was integral to what a Fangyan was. Now, the transformation of Beijing Fangyan into a national language was partly done through public policy. The government decreed that the national language should be taught in schools, encouraged national language use in radio and cinema, and supported magazines like National Language Weekly or Monthly that defended the government policy and offered short, accessible language lessons. By the 1930s, these encouragements slightly became threats. One of the examples that is often given is the example of cinema. In the 1930s, Chiang Kai-shek's government attempted to censor cinema in Chinese Fangyan besides the national language, in particular targeting the thriving Cantonese movie industry in Guangzhou. On the one hand, these policies were not terribly effective at getting people to speak the national language. Most children didn't attend schools in the 1930s, and among those that did, the central government really didn't have the reach to regulate what language teachers used in the classroom, nor were teachers really putting this on their highest priority list, right? There was a lot of emphasis, in particular in rural education, on literacy. Very few people were talking about, like, how do we promulgate the national oral standard? And actually, I interviewed a man who was in charge of teacher training for Putonghua promulgation in the 1950s. And he learned the national language in the 30s, but he was very proud of it and said that he was the only person he had ever met for whom that was true, right? That he went to a really special school. So, beyond this, right, while the Cantonese movie ban sparked fierce debates among filmmakers and cultural critics, they wrote a lot of op-eds, it was really difficult to enforce. So as they were writing these op-eds defending their positions back and forth, most filmmakers either moved their production to Hong Kong, San Francisco, or they simply just didn't send them in for government approval. We have to remember that when this ban happened, it was in the midst of war with Japan, and so the central government kind of had other things on their mind. Okay, but despite the fact that the government could not enforce these policies, their mere existence does still reinforce a hierarchy, and I think that that's sort of important to recognize, right? Whether people spoke it or not, Beijing's Fangyan had a new name, literally language of the nation, right? Guoyu is the term we would use. And Guoyu became a household term, peppered throughout newspapers, discussed on radio, and repeated in children's textbooks. In other words, regardless of who spoke it, regardless of the fact that perhaps kids weren't actually learning this Guoyu with their Guoyu textbooks, they still had the textbooks, right? And national language policies in this way normalized a hierarchy by lionizing one language as the national standard and implicitly defining everything else as non-standard. And sometimes this was done in ways that weren't even explicit. They were done in ways where the act of doing, right, the act of creating a hierarchy was smothered into discourse and hidden behind claims of objectivity or science. The clearest example of this to me was the discipline of linguistics. Linguistics in China underwent a huge transformation in the early decades of the 20th century, galvanized in particular by the May 4th movement, a series of protests against Japan's acquisition of Germany's colonies in China that dovetailed with ongoing calls from educated elites for a complete upheaval of China's core cultural institutions and intellectual frameworks. In the midst of this movement, academics, inspired by May 4th praise for scientific inquiry, began to eagerly develop new university programs meant to create modern, empirical knowledge about the country, its landscape, and its people. Beginning in the early 1920s, a group of Chinese scholars began to advocate for the introduction of a more scientific study of languages at Chinese universities. These men, many of whom had received their doctorates in the United States or Europe, claimed that traditional ways of studying Chinese languages were outdated and unscientific, and as a result, the only proper way to study Chinese languages was to draw on methodologies of comparative linguistics, which came from decades of European and American presumptions about the way that languages relate to one another. Now, with these sort of presumptions, these men simply felt it was objective truth that human languages existed upon a taxonomic tree, all connected to one singular root. If that sounds a little vague, I'll let Professor of English Lin Yutang explain it. There should be no confusion as to the definition of Fangyan. The world's languages are connected in one system called a family of languages, Yu Yan Shi. So the little brackets, he himself translated this into English, like the stuff in the brackets. Language families are then divided into Yuyan, or languages, and within each language there are divisions of Fangyan, or dialects. We ought to declare that when we speak of Fangyan today, we are using it with the meaning from modern linguistics. Okay, so what Lin is saying here is that any study of Chinese Fangyan needed to graft onto particular models of this family of languages, and then dialects, right? And to give sort of a visualization here, a lot of these presumptions came from a model that looks something a bit like this. That's really small, I know. This is a 19th century model. I should have blown it up, I'm realizing now at the time. But it's a 19th century model called the Stambah Model, and it basically, it's a map of the Indo-European language family. But to me, what's really important here, right, is that we have language families that branch into languages, and all these itty bitty little fingers at the end here are dialects, right? So visually, I think this just sort of brings into focus what Lin Yutang was explaining. Okay, so you'll notice here that dialects stem from or evolve from languages, right? We're looking at this almost like we're looking at a biological taxonomy. And for Lin, the only proper way to study Fangyan was to treat them as variants of a larger language. And this presumption was baked into research models of most dialectologists in China after the May 4th movement. There's a lot in my book about like the particular models of dialectology in the 1930s, as well as how linguists treat the national language. There's a lot of charts. And I can talk more about that in Q&A if you would like, but I'll just sort of leave it here for now. Now, this is not to say that Lin or other dialectologists directly claimed that Fangyan derived from the national language, since linguistically that's just not true, right? And they knew that. But when they, on the one hand, go around insisting that there's this hierarchical model that is objective fact, and simultaneously public policy and media are claiming there is one national language and everything else is not a language, it's very easy to see how this model helps to subtly and like almost wordlessly contribute to the linguistic hierarchies we see today. So what's the takeaway here? To me, sort of the expectation in the early 20th century that in order for China to be a nation, it needed to have a national representative language, created the broad assumption that there could be only one Chinese language. So that's the first takeaway. The second takeaway is that the creation of a national language that took only one Fangyan as its standard created the political will to allow one Fangyan to gain a cultural significance that other Chinese languages across the country didn't have. And third, that cultural and political significance was emphasized through a number of venues, from education to media to academia. Nonetheless, there are some really important caveats to these generalizations. In the Republican period, the ability to reinforce this hierarchy was very uneven. Not everyone was exposed to this media or education, and in newspapers and periodicals, while there were a lot of articles that emphasized the importance of the national language, there was also a lot of rhetoric that emphasized that the national language was just another language, like all of their mother tongues. Indeed, as I will talk about in a moment, there were even other political movements that argued that the promulgation of one Fangyan as the national language and the subordination of other mother tongues was antithetical to modern China, namely the Communist Party. Moreover, while speaking the national language was often tied to patriotism, generally speaking, popular rhetoric did not tie it directly, speaking the national language, directly to political loyalty. The one exception was Cantonese movies. There was a little bit of that rhetoric, but generally speaking, that wasn't there. And finally, for the lives of everyday people, the best I can tell, most people went on just simply speaking what they spoke, right? Didn't affect, I think, your average everyday people. Yet today, as I already introduced, the notion that Mandarin is the Chinese language is normative, pervasive, and importantly, political. To understand how this happened, we need to look at language policy after 1949. After the creation of the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party renamed Guoyu as Putonghua, or the common speech, though they, like the government they overthrew, also based this language on the phonology of Beijing. And like their predecessors, they also viewed Fangyan as hierarchically subordinate to the national language. Unlike their predecessors, however, the new communist state integrated academia with pedagogy, making the hierarchy between national language and Fangyan a central part of how Putonghua was promulgated on a mass scale. Moreover, they tied this policy to political loyalty, making the choice of which language to speak politically fraught. Now, part of the reason was there was an ideological shift that happened in the early 1950s. As I just mentioned, right before 1949, the Chinese Communist Party actually set itself apart from the KMT by claiming that they would be the party of linguistic and ethnic pluralism. Communist language proposals before 1949 frequently emphasized the importance of accommodating China's linguistic diversity, of celebrating its vernacular languages, Chinese or otherwise, and creating a script and policies that did not privilege one language over another. One example is a romanization system that really took off within sort of like Yan'an communist circles before that, for 1949, was called La Dinghua, if this is how it would be written. And it's sort of like what set it apart, its creators explained, is that it can be used by all Chinese Fangyan, right? It's not specific to one of them, and therefore is more inclusive. Yet by the early 1950s, Chinese policy advisors began to discuss how to move from being a rebel party to a ruling party. When they did so, they began to reimagine the costs and benefits of promoting one national standard. Throughout this process, many Chinese bureaucrats began to look abroad for inspiration, for ideas about how to create a language policy consistent with Marxist ideals. And in particular, they looked at the Soviet Union. In 1950, that inspiration came from a pamphlet written by Joseph Stalin. In this short pamphlet, Marxism and the Problem of Linguistics, Stalin made a sweeping declaration about language. They were not part of the superstructure. So it's sort of Marxist theory, right? There's the base, the economic base, and the superstructure, which are things that emanate from the base, right? Which meant that languages did not, since they were not part of the superstructure, they didn't change with shifts in the base, shifts in the like the sort of the status of economic development. Rather, Stalin argued that they were an inextricable part of the societies that spoke them. Sort of to make this really, really simple, Stalin believed that like Russian just served everybody all the time throughout history, right? It didn't, like, Russian wasn't the language of the proletariat, right? It didn't, like, language didn't change when you move from feudalism to capitalism or capitalism to socialism, right? Like, language stays consistent, okay? This fact, Stalin claimed, drew a stark line between languages and dialects because they belonged to societies and nations, right? Languages belong to nations. Dialects, on the other hand, and this is how he explained them, were dominated by and subordinate to the single and common language of the tribe or nationality, devoid of all linguistic independence and doomed to stagnation, okay? So on the one hand, languages don't change with the superstructure, don't change with sort of economic development. On the other hand, languages belong to nations. Dialects, they fade away, they change, they go away. They're not important. Languages are what's important, okay? Now, this article was translated into Chinese in 1951 and was widely discussed by scholars in Chinese academia. In the periodical Chinese language, 中国语文, an academic publication published by the Chinese Academy of Sciences, scholars wrote dozens, hundreds of pages about what this pamphlet meant for China. And even years later, most articles that even mentioned the word Fangyan or Marxism or language cited Stalin, right? This is just all of them cite this, right? Ultimately, as they interpreted it, Stalin's words meant that China not only had to have a national language that would, in Stalin's words, serve all members of their society equally, but simultaneously, Fangyan were just not all that important to preserve. One scholar, Xiao Rongfen, interpreted in 1953, he's shown here in a more recent photo, couldn't find an older photo. He explained that languages followed society as they moved in history, whereas dialects remained stagnant because languages, like societies, struggled, whereas dialects did not. So he explains, as societies struggle, so too did the languages of nationalities struggle. It is through the process first of struggle, then of amalgamation, that languages become the communicative tools of the modern nation. This cannot be said of dialects. Their minute differences will inevitably be integrated into the unifying nature of the language itself. And I'm sorry, my cat decided to come and hang out and listen. Okay. Okay, for Xiao, this phonetic differences among Fangyan, which he downplayed here as minute, mattered little. Rather, what was important was that the language of the nation, which would follow the nation as it transformed into a more modern socialist nation. He imagined languages behaving like the populations that spoke them, and as these populations struggled to modernize, their languages would serve them. Fangyan, which he did render as sort of the Russian word dialect, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, I don't speak Russian, but it's spelled like the English word dialect, but with a K. So Fangyan, either way, never struggled, right? They didn't struggle to separate or struggle to unify. Okay, so armed with their interpretation of Stalin's theories on language and nation, which empowered a state emphasis on promulgating the national language and empowered them to just sort of not worry about Fangyan, what Xiao Rongfen says, right, is that we cannot go against this rule that Fangyan eventually disappeared. We could either sort of like promote this rule or we can do nothing, but we can't change that, right, that Fangyan will eventually disappear. So with that sort of idea, we have language policy that's crafted. The new standards, the nation's new script, pronunciation, and romanization system were formally revealed in October of 1955 and then sort of like blasted out through newspapers and such in 1956. Here's some examples, right? In addition to announcing the content of this new language, the directive from the central government also announced potential areas of attention and plans to address them, how to train teachers, how to begin enforcing simplified characters and prints of materials, et cetera, et cetera. Among the problems they outlined was a concern that Fangyan speakers would have distinct regional struggles to learn the national language. To address this, the directive suggested that the state sponsor a nationwide Fangyan survey meant to, in their words, facilitate the learning of Putonghua for each region. 2 years later, scholars descended on the countryside to record the local language of each township, village, and district. Within each year, they collected data and organized them into handbooks, which were then given to local elementary school teachers and supervisors with the expectation that it would help them learn Putonghua or teach it. The survey was really instrumental, I think, in reinforcing the hierarchy between national language and Fangyan in the PRC. Why? The entire purpose of it was to, for the purposes of teaching, define Fangyan solely in relation to their national language. Even beyond its stated purpose, right, which I just said, the materials that the scholars used ensured that if we think about this as a project of knowledge production, the very data they produced framed Fangyan as something that can only be made legible, that can only be understood in relation to the national language. Each researcher was given government standardized materials to guide the kind of information they gathered, which included a list of characters. So this was the Fangyan Dialects, right, is a Fangyan survey character list, where they had people read that list aloud. And they were supposed to create little cards here. This is a sample that was given to them that essentially said, like, here's the character, here's how it's pronounced in Beijing Fangyan, here is how it's pronounced in the target sort of Fangyan that they're surveying, and then you put the location here in the corner, okay. Researchers were then required to publish these results, these comparative results, in handbooks, right? This one's by a more famous person. Wang Li's pretty famous, but a lot of them were published by just like survey research groups. And the purpose of these handbooks of like how people from such and such a region learn to speak Putonghua was geared in, as they explained, to help them correct their pronunciation of the national language and fix problems that speakers of particular Fangyan had. Thus, by 1957, Fangyan and the PRC had been deemed remnants of historical stagnation, they had been deemed derivative of the national language, and they had been deemed a problem in the educational system that had to be fixed. But it was not until 1958 that I think these hierarchies became fully imbued with political connotations that still drive narratives about Fangyan and Putonghua today. That was 1958 was the year of the Great Leap Forward, a sweeping economic policy meant to demonstrate the people's superhuman endeavors in economic production and cultural rejuvenation. The Great Leap Forward spirit was first and foremost applied to grain and steel production, like double or quadruple grain production, catch up to Britain in terms of steel. But the movement's rhetoric imbued almost all areas of life, including national language promulgation. This included sort of like a great leap forward into Putonghua promulgation was the term that was used quite a lot. And to see what this sort of looked like, they would have these sort of big conferences called Teaching Putonghua Achievement Exhibitions. And here is a speech from one in 1965. There are those who believe when the Liberation Army is at our defense that it can be considered doing revolution, or to participate in the socialism education movement is to do revolution. But as for promulgating Putonghua for the revolution, is this placing its value too high? Actually, in this age of our great revolution, whether it's a large-scale movement or everyday activities, it is all part of revolutionary work. To do educational work is to do revolution. To do cultural, to do cinematic work is to do revolution. To be a clerk, a service person, a ticket seller, a train attendant, or a radio broadcaster is all to do revolution. And then he ends with, and that means speaking the national language is to do revolution. So the Great Leap Forward rhetoric, in other words, equated speaking Putonghua with other nation-building efforts, like developing oil fields or even winning wars. What goes unstated, however, is that if speaking Putonghua both represented and facilitated doing revolution, within the dangerous fervor of the Great Leap Forward, then theoretically not speaking the national language could amount to not supporting revolutionary goals. Now, I really want to stress that there is a huge gap between rhetoric and practice. Okay, people continued to speak their local languages even through the Cultural Revolution. People got in sort of trouble for doing all sorts of things. As far as I know, and I haven't interviewed everybody, but I didn't hear really any stories that I know of people getting in trouble during the Cultural Revolution for speaking Fangyan. In fact, I heard a lot of stories of people sort of like, especially Red Guards as sent down youths, going to the sort of a particular village and being told, hey, learn to speak their Fangyan, right? So there's a huge gap here between rhetoric and practice. But I argue that this rhetoric and politicization filtered down. It imbued pedagogy, media, and even the very sort of framework we use to talk about these things, helping to reinforce the linguistic hierarchies we see today. Now, at this point, you may be asking yourself, why does this even matter? Calling something a language or a dialect doesn't seem like an earth-shattering event. But the words I want to argue that it kind of is. Right? The words that we use bound observable things to a series of assumptions, ideas, and cultural touchstones. And when they do that, they frame our thinking and guide our actions. To presume that Fangyan had all of the same connotations as dialects is to force China's diverse linguistic landscape into a hierarchy in which all but one are subordinate. And that creates all kinds of assumptions, and that does guide our actions. I'd also like to point out that calling Fangyan dialects is also significant because this assumption of subordination is not limited to linguistic structure alone. Calling one language a national standard and everything else variants implies that the national language can alone represent a sense of national identity and citizenship. Ultimately, to speak a language is to grasp and own a particular kind of cultural power. To speak a dialect is to settle for an expression of identity that is limited in its scope and diminished in its significance. Perhaps because of the inherent power imbued in the term Fangyan, language, right? The power imbued in the term language, the framing of Fangyan as dialects has always had critics. And so to end this talk, I just want to here offer a quick glance at an example that reveals the kind of pushback these linguistic hierarchies have inspired. My first, I think I have time for two. I'll do very, very quickly. One comes from the city of Guangzhou in 2010, where a protest gathered in response to a decision by the municipal government to increase television offerings in Putonghua, thereby reducing its programming in Cantonese. In July of that year, protesters gathered in Guangzhou's People's Park, adorned in t-shirts, where they sang Cantonese pop songs. This picture here shows a man at the protest. His sign reads, "I love Cantonese, I don't speak stewed winter melon." I want to draw attention to a couple of elements here. The first is the use of the term stewed winter melon, which is slang for Putonghua that is homophonous in Cantonese. The second, however, is that his little heart here in the middle is a flag of the People's Republic of China. He's appealing to patriotism. And that appeal to patriotism reminds us how since the early 20th century, Chineseness was believed to include China's linguistic diversity, that because Fangyan were authentic representations of the Chinese national identity, diversity could be patriotic. This protester, in other words, took the political implications of language speaking and flipped the script, reclaiming Chineseness for his mother language. Beyond this protest, this reclaiming of a Chinese identity from a hegemonic homogenous standard is deeply relevant to current events in Hong Kong. 2 years ago, a massive protest emerged in opposition to an extradition bill between Hong Kong and China, which subsequently grew into a broader movement against the erosion of Hong Kong's cultural independence and in support of a unique identity that sets itself apart from the PRC. Within this movement, Cantonese has become, as one professor put it, a language of protest. To get a sense of how important Cantonese is to the spirit of the movement, I just want to show some images that were widely circulated on Facebook. There are lots of examples I could bring from Hong Kong, but I think this one really sort of hits the themes of this talk. So it was a series of like 20 images, all of which were meant to show how Hong Kong is different from China. Some of the examples given are rather political, right? Like this one is meant to highlight like how the creators of this images, right, sees a difference between the free market in Hong Kong and the not free market in mainland China. But this one, I want to warn everybody, there's going to be some bad words on the screen, but I will do my best to X them out, okay? So some of these differences, I'm going to X out the bad words here, are cultural. right? So this one about language, right, says Chinese speak Mandarin, which has a 4-tone system and more than 100 years of history, whereas Hong Kongers speak Cantonese, which has a 9-tone system and 2,000 years of history. This image to me is really striking in how it evokes the arguments made by certain creators of the first Chinese national language over a century ago, which believed that a true national language should be connected to the ancient roots of Chinese history, and some Fangyan had that connection better than others, and that there was a lot of pushback in the South about the idea that Beijing's language really had that connection to sort of the like Han Chinese, the origin of the Han Chinese people. More than that, to me, this image implies that Hong Kongers are seeking not only to carve out their own identity, they are seeking to sever the bonds between Putonghua and Chineseness and reclaim that Chinese collective identity from Beijing. In this way, what counts as a language and what is merely a dialect is a battle over a place in a cultural hierarchy. It is a battle over whose language is most important to the nation and who has the power to define it. Our language, the very lens through which we see the world, carries enormous significance in how we see ourselves as people. As Chicana studies feminist scholar Gloria Anzaldúa says, my language is my skin. It is no wonder then that the history of how Putonghua became a language and Fangyan became dialects is about much more than semantics. It is a story about what it means to be Chinese and who has the right to represent it. Thank you. Okay, I'll stop share.
Wonderful, thank you so much. What a fascinating talk. I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions. Gina, are you able to see? I'll just open the Q&A now because there's a couple of questions there. So the first question is, how did the KMT's language policy develop or adapt once they fled to Taiwan?
Sorry, yes. Should I answer that first or should I can, I'll go ahead and answer that first. Yeah. And I'll answer it by saying that this is actually something that was sort of on the back of my head, like back of my mind, but something that I know a lot less about. I'll sort of say what I know with the caveat that my research just didn't take me to Taiwan in the way that I wanted it to. My understanding is that essentially sort of the promulgation of Goyu, right, or Mandarin in the KMT became really strict under sort of the authoritarian rule of the KMT through the 1980s. I remember talking to people in Taiwan who said that they got in trouble for speaking non-Putonghua languages. In particular, Taiwanese kids got made fun of in the schoolyard, and like advertisers had struggled to put their advertisements on radio. And then there was a real pushback against that in the 1980s and 90s. And today, Taiwan recognizes a few Fangyan or a few other Chinese languages as sort of like languages of Taiwan. I believe it's Taiwanese and Hakka. There might be others. Those are the ones that I know of off the top of my head. But I think there's some really good work being done. There's some good work being done also in Hong Kong on this topic, but it's I know less about that. I'm sorry. That's the best of what I know.
Yeah. So there was another question there about Hong Kong and Macau and the questions about sustaining Cantonese there, but we might move on from that one then if that's not an area you've looked at yet.
I can answer that a little bit. Yeah. So what's interesting is, and Hong Kong is I know a bit more. So in the, I believe it was the 60s or 70s in Hong Kong, there was a fight to make Chinese a language of the colony as opposed to English, and they purposefully left it vague. And so that's still true today, right? Chinese is an official language of Hong Kong. And sort of they did that because I think that there was this sort of fear of what would happen if the national language in mainland China sort of became more dominant. And so they left it vague, right? And so how did they develop a specific Cantonese system? Well, once they were able to sort of learn teach Chinese in schools, that opened the door to Cantonese pedagogy, which is one of the reasons that Cantonese is one of the few Chinese Fangyan that has a really robust pedagogical, like there's textbooks, right? You can take Cantonese classes. You can take the Taiwanese as well, in part because there's also this pedagogy. Do I see parallels between the mainland's Putonghua promulgation and the standardization of Cantonese in these colonies? That's so interesting. To me, the main difference is that, so to me, sort of Cantonese, as far as it being standardized, is standardized much in the way to me that like American English is standardized. Like there's no government body telling us in the United States how to speak English, right? We learn it primarily because of the standardization of pedagogy. There's my cat again. But whereas in mainland China, right, there's actually there's a law that says what Mandarin is, right? Which to me, that's a big distinction.
Yeah. There's another question asking, besides it's in the other chat. Besides Cantonese, are there any other regional dialects that have also engaged in this kind of protest against the national language?
That's a great question. And hello from New Zealand. So I've seen as far as I know, I haven't seen, as far as other Fangyan, like outright protests. Possibly Taiwanese, I think would be the case, but that was in Taiwan, right? There's been some really interesting sort of like focus on in music and in popular culture that is an indirect kind of protest. So like I don't think this man is like selling platinum records, but there's like a Shanghainese rapper who makes a big deal about how like Mandarin isn't the language that he understands his own national identity through, that has to be Shanghainese. And he talks a lot about how important Shanghainese is to him. And to me, that's a kind of protest, right? It's not people with signs in a park, right? But it is that. You see similar sorts of things, I think, happening in subtle ways in Sichuan, again through music, and again through rap. But I think one of the reasons that you see a lot more in Cantonese is because, as sort of the other question asked, there's a bit more structure to that language. There's popular culture in it, and I also think that there's a really, really strong sort of like ethno-nationalism among Cantonese speakers that I think also promotes that as well.
Sorry. Yes, yeah. I mean, just to kind of comment on the Cantonese stands out, I think, in many ways. Even when I was learning Chinese at a community language school as a child, you could actually do Mandarin or Cantonese. That was in the 1990s. So in Australia, in community languages, there was a formalized structure for studying Cantonese. We have a question from John Von Koalis asking, how do the languages of minority people figure into this? So yeah, I was also interested in that question, I guess, is there a difference when you're characterized as a nationality for your language policy then?
So there's two ways to answer that, I think. The first way to answer that to me is sort of looking at like this early 1950s, like how that policy, when everybody was talking about Stalin's pamphlet, there was a lot of panic of like, well, Cantonese is a dialect, and therefore it falls under this category of dialect. But Mongolian is clearly a language, right? Because it's spoken by people who aren't Han Chinese. So there was a lot of sort of consternation about that. And eventually they just sort of made this distinction based upon sort of ethnicity, right? That language represented ethnicity, and that's what made this distinction between language and dialect. And that's sort of in academia. As far as policy goes, right? That I think has changed a lot in the last 10 to 15 years or so. So what's interesting is that in 2001, the PRC government actually passed its very first language law, an actual law that dictated how these things work, and languages of ethnic of non-Han Chinese ethnic groups are given rights that Fangyan speakers are not. And it outlines sort of like where Fangyan can be spoken and where they can't. But there is a lane in this language law that says people of who are not Han Chinese, have the right to learn their language in schools. And so that's something that's technically afforded to them. But within sort of I think the last 10 to 15 years, that has really been eroded for a variety of reasons. There was a big protest in Mongolia this past year about the erosion of Mongolian language in schools. One of the things that we know a lot about the internment camps in Xinjiang is that one of the things is that like there's a huge push, like one of the things they have to do, right, is they have to learn to speak Putonghua as part of this. I don't know that I like the re-education, right, as far as rhetoric goes, but this is but Mandarin promulgation is a part of these internment camps, right? And so I guess on the one hand, one difference is that it's much harder to learn a Fengyan in formal schooling than it is to learn an ethnic minority language, right? But on the other hand, I think that protests to learn ethnic minority languages more tend to be sort of treated with far more harshness from the state. Yeah.
Great. That actually also answers another question we had in the chat about Xinjiang as well.
Yeah, I see that. Sorry. Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I'm looking back and forth, and there's so many great questions. Yeah, and so the question asks sort of what evidence of the claim of cultural genocide in terms of the spread of local language there. I clearly sort of come at this from the perspective that the ability to speak your own language is a human rights issue, right? And so being forced, in particular in sort of like being locked up and forced in internment camps is to me certainly, I think, cultural genocide works there, but even sort of broadly outside the camps, right? This erosion of the right to learn and speak and pass on your language. Yeah, I think that's a core part of who we are, and it's a core part of our culture. So yeah, I think that fits into that.
Great. We've got a question. There's kind of continued from a longer comment, but the question at the end is, what could be done to maintain some kind of equilibrium between, Mandarin as a national language and various dialects?
That's a great question. I was asked this a few weeks ago, and my answer was just sort of like, I have to believe that this is possible, right? I have to believe that language rights can be a part of a society. And there's a lot of talk of like, well, and this comes again, it really strikes me as the rhetoric that came from all these discussions about Stalin's pamphlet in the 1950s, which is that, well, like dialects are going to go away anyway, right? Actually, I take a lot of inspiration from Gerald Roche, who's a scholar, and I am entirely blanking at the university that he teaches at. But he argues, right, that languages don't die; they are let to die, right? That this is something that is a choice that we make, right? We can preserve languages that we care about and make them a core part of society, or we can let them die. Another good example here actually is Welsh, which had been sort of really pushed out in the UK in the 60s and 70s, and has seen a real revitalization because that was a choice, right? That people in that sort of like a variety of sort of groups within Wales made, right, to really care about revitalizing this language. So what does that look like? I mean, to me, sort of like China, like before, gosh, like 1970s, very few people spoke fluently the national language, right? And people got around, people learned to communicate, right? And I think that there's a lot more sort of ability to communicate than we think there is, right? I think most people in China today are bi and trilingual, and that doesn't necessarily mean that anybody's losing out on anything. And so I think that there's more possibility for revitalization than, and linguistic sort of like plurality than we presume that there is.
Wonderful. I might just have, there's one last question.
Yeah.
That is from someone who's actually learning Mandarin at the moment in order to be an interpreter, who her friends who speak Cantonese have said there's no need to learn anything besides Putonghua. Is this a kind of ideological statement? How do you respond to that kind of idea? Should people push back against this notion that there's only Putonghua?
So I very much believe that we should push back against that. Is it a political statement? I think that one of the things is that these sort of political rhetoric can often be sort of like smothered into other kinds of discourse that seem non-political. The argument that I get a lot is that economically, right? It just makes sense to learn Putonghua because more people speak it. But to me, that sort of, whether or not this, like whoever's saying this is being purposefully political, the idea that it is economically valuable, first of all, I don't know that that's necessarily always the case, right? I don't know that that's necessarily, there's like data behind that, but even if there was, again, this is a choice that we as a global community, as a transnational community are making. And to me, I don't know that I would say to that person, like, you're being ideological, but at the same time, I do think there's a history behind this presumption, right? This very sort of like, and I do get that statement a lot, right? That this very practical of like, well, what else are you gonna do? It's the national language, right? Like all countries do this, like what all country, you know, a lot, you're right, like a lot of all countries do this. That doesn't mean that's necessarily the most ethical or greatest thing to do, I think, so.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gina. That was a fabulous talk. Lots of things to think about, both in terms of history and in terms of the future direction of when we think about Chinese language study and what that might mean. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We're going to have to leave the questions here for today.
Please do feel free to email me. I put my email in the beginning slide if you have any other questions. And thank you so much. So many people came. I'm so excited. So thank you so much.
Yes, thanks everyone for attending. I'll put a couple of links in the chat to sign up for the Australian Society for Asian Humanities seminar series list, so you can find out more about these kind of activities, as well as our Facebook page. So thanks everyone for coming today.
Thank you so much.